They came in sight of 30 or 40 windmills, and as soon as Don Quixote saw them, he said to his squire, "Look there, friend Sancho Panza, where 30 or more monstrous giants present themselves, all of whom I mean to engage in battle and slay, and with whose spoils we shall begin to make our fortunes. For this is righteous warfare, and it is God's good service to sweep so evil a breed from off the face of the earth." "What giants?" said Panza. "Those thou seest there," answered his master, "with the long arms, and some have them nearly 2 leagues long." "Look, your worship," said Sancho, "what we see there are not giants, but windmills, and what seem to be their arms are the sails that turned by the wind make the millstone go." "It is easy to see," replied Don Quixote, "that thou art not used to this business of adventures. Those are giants, and if thou art afraid, away with thee out of this and betake thyself to prayer while I engage them in fierce and unequal combat." So saying, he gave the spur to his steed Rocinante, heedless of the cries his squire Sancho sent after him, warning him that most certainly they were windmills and not giants he was going to attack. He, however, was so positive that they were giants that he neither heard the cries of Sancho nor perceived, near as he was, what they were, but made at them, shouting, "Fly not, cowards and vile beings, for a single knight attacks you." Don Quixote was published in 2 parts in the early 17th century by Spanish novelist Miguel de Cervantes. The book, which was incredibly way ahead of its time, details the adventures of Alonso Quijano, a Spanish nobleman who becomes obsessed with romantic tales of knights and chivalry as he begins to approach old age. Quijano decides to become a traveling knight and adventurer, following in the footsteps of his fictional heroes, and recruits his neighbor, a poor farmer named Sancho Panza, to be his loyal squire. Together, they go off in search of adventure and romance, and finding nothing particularly adventurous or romantic out in the wider world, Don Quixote just builds a fantasy world around himself in which he is the hero, perhaps most iconically exemplified in Don Quixote's battle with windmills, which he convinces himself are giants, which is, the thing I just read at the beginning of this video. Don Quixote is widely considered to be the first modern Western novel, and for a first try, Cervantes really knocked it out of the park. It's a complex and rich story, packed with themes that are famously open to interpretation. Some see it as a tragedy with a sympathetic view of the eponymous Don and his desire for meaning and chivalric virtue in a harshly unromantic world, while others see it as a comedy, ridiculing Quixote for his self-absorbed illusions of grandeur. For me personally, Don Quixote is much less of a farce than it might seem at first glance. While the adventures of a rich old dude tilting at windmills may seem far-fetched and fantastical, I think it actually hits pretty close to the mark in terms of how most people in the West participate in reality. We are all prone to idealist notions about reality, false consciousness about human society, and we have a sweeping tendency to manufacture illusionary enemies in our imaginations when we should be focusing on the very real threats which surround us. I wish I could say that the political left, anarchists, communists, and other sorts of socialists, of which I am a part, were immune to this kind of Quixotic pseudo-adventurism, but unfortunately we are very prone to it, as evidenced by the cycle of inane and exhausting discourse which has plagued us since the beginning of the left. Brazilian Marxist historian Jones Manoel wrote about the proclivity for Western leftists to keep our heads bouncing in the clouds instead of grounded in material reality in his article, Western Marxism, the Fetish for Defeat and Christian Culture. Manoel begins by pointing out the tendency for Western Marxists to view Eastern socialist movements with a heavy emphasis on the influence of religion and mysticism in those movements. Every time that they speak of Marxism in Asia, in China, Korea, or Vietnam, or when they speak of popular movements in Africa, such as in Egypt or Libya, they highlight the influence of religion on these political movements and the national adaptation of Marxism. When any Marxist researcher studies, for example, Chinese Marxism, they are obliged to address the influence of Confucius philosophy on Chinese culture in a general manner, and on Chinese Marxism in particular. Likewise, the influence that Islam has on many African countries is always taken into account in analysis of socialist nations such as Algeria. When the time comes to look at Marxism in Western politics, however, the influence of Christianity in the construction of symbolic, subjective, and theoretical universe of this Marxism is rarely taken into account. It is as if in Asia, Confucianism has an influence on politics, in Africa, Islam has an influence on politics, but in Brazil, in the US, in France, in Portugal, Christianity does not perform a similar role in forming historic subjectivity. Manuel goes on to point out that this constitutes a complete lack of self-awareness on the part of Western leftists. Manuel points to Gramsci's observation that the Catholic Church is the oldest institution in the Western world and the sweeping influence Christianity has had on cultures throughout Europe and the Americas. Manuel encourages us on the Western left to examine our own socialist movements with the same critical eye towards mysticism and religion that we apply in our analysis of other cultures. In his own analysis, Manuel establishes a link between Christian values and Western Marxism, writing, "There's a separation between Western and Eastern Marxism. Western Marxism is basically a kind of Marxism which has as a key characteristic never exercised political power. It is a Marxism that more and more frequently concerned itself with philosophical and aesthetic issues. It has pulled back, for example, from criticism of political economy and the problem of the conquest of political power. More and more, it has taken a historic distance from the concrete experiences of socialist transition in the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, Cuba, and so forth. This Western Marxism considers itself to be a superior to Eastern Marxism because it hasn't tarnished Marxism by transforming it into an ideology of the state, like, for example, Soviet Marxism, and it has never been authoritarian, totalitarian, or violent. This Marxism preserves the purity of theory to the detriment of the fact that it has never produced a revolution anywhere on the face of the earth. This is a very important point. Wherever a victorious socialist revolution has taken place in the West, like Cuba, it is much more closely associated with the so-called Eastern Marxism than with this Western Marxism produced in Western Europe, the United States, Canada, and parts of South America. This Marxism is proud of its purity, and this is the first elemental characteristic that derives from Christianity. Manuel goes on to write that Christian theologians depict their own religion as rooted in love, equality, loving thy neighbor, compassion, and nonviolence, despite the fact that it has been a fundamental weapon in the legitimization of slavery, the Crusades, and colonialism, and despite the coziness of various elements of the Catholic Church with Nazi fascism and military dictatorships. Christian apologists, according to Manuel, are always quick to explain that such actions performed by Christians and in the name of Christianity do not corrupt the doctrine. They are either false expressions of Christianity or they are facts, like potatoes in a sack, that have no theoretical, political, or most importantly, theological meaning. So the fact that history denies the affirmation that Christianity is based on compassion and peace does not change or challenge the doctrine. Manuel sees this Christian cultural obsession with purity of doctrine at the expense of acknowledgement of harsh material realities and historical fact as a heavy influence on Western Marxists. According to Manuel, many Western Marxists act the same way. Their biggest worry is the purity of the doctrine. Every time that historical facts challenge the doctrine or show the complexity of the practical operationality of elements of the theory, they deny that these elements are part of the story of Marxist theory and doctrine. This is, for example, what doctrines of betrayal are built on. Every movement that appears to stray a bit from these pure models that were created a priori is explained through the concept of betrayal. Manuel also points out the tendency for Western Marxists to romanticize suffering and extreme poverty as another cultural influence of Christianity on our movements. It is very common in Western leftist culture, writes Manuel, to support martyrs and suffering. Everyone today likes Salvador Allende. Why? Salvador Allende is a victim, a martyr. He was assassinated in Pinochet's coup d'etat. When Hugo Chavez was alive, many sectors of the left turned their nose up at him. If he'd been killed, for example, in the 2002 coup attempt, he would be adored by the immense majority of the Western left today as a symbol of suffering and martyrdom. Since he continued exercising power as a leader of a political process which by necessity had various contradictions, he was increasingly abandoned as time passed. I don't even have to mention what happened to Maduro here. These same sectors which celebrate and support the idea of Allende because he defended democratic socialism do not see or do not want to see that Allende governed almost entirely through decrees. At the time, the Chilean constitution had a legal mechanism which enabled the executive branch to govern by decrees that did not have to be approved by Parliament or the Supreme Court. So Allende was able to make laws through decrees which bypassed Congress and the Supreme Court. Since Allende did not have a majority in Congress and suffered a lot from the bourgeois opposition, he basically governed through decree throughout his entire mandate. This kind of action today is enough justification to label any leader that practices it as authoritarian, to compare him to Trump, Bolsonaro, or Erdogan. If Allende was alive today, he would also be criticized, but he died. Manuel goes on to point out how Vietnam has also come increasingly under fire as the people have been lifted out of suffering and extreme poverty through socialist programs. Everyone supported Vietnam when it was under attack, being destroyed and bombed for over 30 years. Vietnam beat Japan in World War II, then had to fight France, and then had to fight the United States. From 1945 to 1975, it spent 30 straight years without being able to build a damn school or hospital because a bomb from France or the United States would drop and destroy it. When the country was finally able to beat all of the colonial and neo-colonial powers and had the opportunity to start planning to build highways, electrical systems, schools, and universities without having bombs land on them the next day and destroy everything that was being done, the country was abandoned by the majority of the left. It lost its charm. It lost its enchantment. There is a fetish for defeat in the Western left. It is an idea that defeat is something majestic. Manoel closes with heavy condemnation of the Western left. Together, the three elements that I just described create a kind of narcissistic orgasm of defeat and purity. The subject takes pride in not having any relationship with the entire historic, concrete movement of the working class, socialist, and liberation revolutions. They take pride in not having any theoretical or political connection to the revolutions in China, Russia, Korea, Vietnam, Algeria, Mozambique, and Angola. They are instead proud of the supposed purity that their theory is not contaminated by the hardship of exercising power, by the contradictions of historical processes. Being pure is what provokes this narcissistic orgasm. This purity is what makes them feel superior. It makes them feel that they have a privileged moral and ethical standpoint compared to other leftists. This kind of Marxism has no critical power. Therefore, the process of rebuilding a revolutionary Marxism in the West has to recognize these symbolic elements, which have become ingrained in Western Marxism that were smuggled in as contraband from Christianity. These elements have to be submitted to radical criticism and surpassed. I highly recommend you give the entire article a read because it's packed with other examples that illustrate Manuel's points and ground them in historical reality. Regardless of whether or not you hold any sympathy or support for modern socialist states like Vietnam, China, or North Korea, I think the broader points that Western leftists are overly obsessed with theory, purity, and idealism still holds true. Western leftists, especially leftist influencers, content creators, and popular social media accounts, have a strong tendency to obsess over hypothetical, idealist constructions of reality with very little grounding in our material world. For a crystal clear example of this, just take a look at the conversation I had with Destiny a couple of years ago. This was presented to me as an opportunity to explain the basic fundamentals of anarchism to Destiny in good faith, but instead, he almost immediately launched into bizarre hypothetical questions about a hypothetical future anarchist society in which all the employees of a factory were racist.
So we can just have like a little hypothetical factory that's running. Let's say that a man was accused of sexually harassing a woman, but all the men were like pretty chill with the guy and think that people are taking this too seriously. Well, how would you organize a factory? What would you do if the majority of the people there were bigoted? What if the workers voted that they didn't want black people working there? How do you get these problems fixed?
This is the form most leftist debates I've seen tend to take: a rabid obsession with hypothetical scenarios and purely theoretical moralizing with no grounding in what's actually happening in the real world. Take a look at the recent attacks against the decolonization and land back movement that's burning its way across social media. We have hordes of non-indigenous Western leftists taking it upon themselves to define decolonization and land back on behalf of indigenous people, producing a never-ending fire hose of analysis and hot takes without even taking the time to talk to indigenous folks and without lifting one single finger to do anything to actually help indigenous people in their struggles. Twitch streamer Lottie Blix expressed their frustration with this situation pretty eloquently in this Twitter thread. White MLs will spend hours on Twitter for days doing analysis on land back and crying about how it's being co-opted instead of doing literally fucking anything to help or support indigenous people. If your knee-jerk reaction to hearing about radical anti-colonialism is to start trying to find all the things potentially wrong with it, you are worse than useless. Just say you're anti-indigenous and be done with it. The only point of contention I have with Lottie's statement is that, unfortunately, it's not just Marxist-Leninists that I see engaging in this kind of idealistic, utopian analysis in lieu of practice. I've seen plenty of anarchists and soc dems engaging in the same behavior, not just in relation to land back, but in relation to every material struggle which is unfolding today. The strange thing to me is that it's not even that difficult to make contact with material reality. I live all the way over here in Vietnam, on the other side of the planet of the struggles in the USA, but in the age of internet, that hasn't really been much of a hindrance to me for getting in touch with comrades to find out what's actually going on in the ground, to find out what they're doing and what they need. For example, during the George Floyd uprisings last year, Luna and I spoke to Black activists and to protesters. We even hosted live streams in which correspondents were sharing what was happening in real time on the ground at protests. We were able to learn about the radical platforms and activities of Black anarchists and communists. We didn't have to speculate and analyze what was going on to generate content. We just talked to people. We asked them questions. We helped signal boost them. We did fundraisers. We learned and tried to support them materially in the real world. When it comes to land back, Luna and I have hosted several panels with Indigenous people from all over the world. We've talked to Indigenous people about their anti-capitalist conceptions of land back, and we've shared their voices directly with our audiences. And believe me, I'm not bragging right now because this was not even remotely difficult. It's easy as hell. All you have to do is reach out and talk to people. They're human beings. We can communicate with them. We can find out what's going on. We can engage with them directly. We don't have to treat them like hypothetical, theoretical, metaphysical constructs. So instead of theorizing, analyzing, and moralizing about them behind their backs as though they're some alien other, we just send them a message and say, hey, you want to talk? And then we talk to them and we find out what's going on. And then if we're able to, we'll try to support them in some way. And if we aren't clear about something, we'll ask them to clarify. And we synthesize their concerns into our own praxis. And we learn a lot along the way. My point isn't that we shouldn't have honest, deep discussions about what's happening around us. I do value theory and analysis. That's why I have this channel. That's why I spend most of my waking life reading theory, reading what people have to say about these movements, trying to articulate this theory in a way that's easy for you, the audience, to understand the things that I'm learning about theory. My point is that these discussions and this theory study should be grounded in reality and focused on practice, praxis, rooted in the working class. Instead of having debates about what we might hypothetically do if South Africans hypothetically decide to kick out all the white people, why not talk to some South African socialists if you really care about South Africa and see what they actually have to say? Ask them how we can support their struggles against white supremacism and capitalism, instead of treating them like a hypothetical other. Is it that complicated? Is it that difficult? I don't think it is. I don't even think that people really care that much about the people in South Africa when they have these hypothetical debates and try to cast them as this scary other that's going to rise up and do a white genocide great replacement. I think that it's just fodder for spectacle and views, and I think the hypotheticals make for great debates that alienize and otherize these actual human beings that are facing actual terrible struggles in the real world. Karl Marx famously wrote in Theses on Feuerbach, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." We aren't going to change the world by sitting around and constructing metaphysical arguments about things that aren't happening in the real world. We can change the world by communicating with the people who are actually suffering from forms of oppression like colonialism and white supremacism, reaching out to them, trying to understand their struggles. We can change the world by raising funds for organizations like Socialist Rifle Association's mutual aid and disaster relief programs, by encouraging workers to join militant unions like the Industrial Workers of the World, by looking at the immediate problems on the ground and developing strategies and programs to build dual power and mutual aid networks in our communities. In the closing of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Friedrich Engels wrote, "To accomplish universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat. To thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions and thus the very nature of this act, to impart to the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and of the meaning of the momentous act it is called upon to accomplish, this is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement, scientific socialism." Engels was pushing back here against utopianism, the tendency for leftists to fixate on idealist constructions of some distant future rather than examining the material conditions of the here and now with an eye towards what we can achieve in praxis in our own lives. Tilting at hypothetical windmills and hypothetical debates and churning out endless analysis might be good spectacle for getting clicks and engagement on social media. Obsessing over suffering and romanticizing poverty and not getting our hands dirty with what's actually happening in the real world may keep our theory pure, but it also keeps us from doing anything or accomplishing anything at all. It's not going to liberate the working class. Theoretical purity is good on paper, and that's all. The only way to make progress in the real world is by dismounting from the high horse of theoretical purity and engaging with the people who have the least to lose and the most to gain, the indigenous, trans, disabled, colonized, and hyper-exploited masses who compose the vast majority of humanity, who aren't concerned with theoretical purity, but are much more concerned with things like getting food, not being murdered, and just surviving from day to day. In his article, Revolution in Practice, Errico Malatesta shared what I believe to be good and relevant advice for the revolutionists, no matter what your ideological tendencies. So if you're not an anarchist, just replace the word anarchist with whatever you are. The following sentence is often repeated. The revolution will be anarchist or will not be at all. This claim may look very revolutionary, very anarchist, however, it is actually nonsense, when it is a means worse than reformism itself to paralyze good and induce people to keep quiet, to peacefully put up with the present, waiting for the forthcoming heaven. Did not revolutions happen in the world when the possibility of an anarchist society was yet to be conceived? Won't any revolution ever happen again until the masses are converted to anarchism? As we fail to convert to anarchism the masses, brutalized by their life conditions, should we give up any revolution and submit to living in a monarchical and bourgeois regime? The truth is that the revolution will be what it may be, and our task is to speed it up as much as possible and strive to make it as radical as possible. Unlike Don Quixote, we, the workers of the world, have very real giants to slay. The giant of capitalism, aided by a host of other giants, such as imperialism, racism, colonialism, transphobia, patriarchy, ableism, and all the other secondary contradictions that keep the working class divided. So please, for the love of God, let's get our heads out from the clouds and let's get to work. I'm American Johnson. This is NonCompete. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time. Have at thee, you son of a bitch! I think I got him.
Such is the faith, the glory of poor Don Quixote.